Ovo morate da pogledate. I sljedeći intervju obavezno morate pogledati. Dakle, čista ekskluziva. Vidite, Bajdena, Putina, Sija, sve velike lidere. Mislite da sami donose velike presudne odluke? Ne. Njih savjetuju ljudi koji su u mnogo čemu mudriji, stručniji od svojih predsjednika. Upravo takav i to kakav naš je gost. To je čovjek koji je direktno, face to face, savjetovao predsjednika Obamu i tadašnjeg potpredsjednika Bajdena, a potom predsjednika Bajdena. Na neki način on je ona druga strana rata. On je Amerika, Zapad, ali i Izrael kao saveznik. Najbitnije u novinarstvu za vas u životu jeste imati dvije strane. Dakle, izuzetan intervju je pred vama, kratko traje, direktan, otvoren sa otkrivanjem velikih tajni. Dakle, ovaj čovjek nije samo osoba koja sve zna, već imajte na umu dok ga gledate da je on i kreator nečega, barem je bio, a to je ako je bio, to su veliki geostrateški planovi koji se prave decenijama unaprijed. Dakle, moguće da je od svega ovoga što se sada dešava nešto i dio njegovog plana. On se zove Charles Kupchan i bio je ovih dana u Sarajevu na jednom skupu, vjerovatno najvažnijem u regionu, organizovanom ove godine. Organizator inicijativa za strateške analize. Organizator je trojica braće mladih, zanimljivost, trojica mladih sarajevskih akademaca sa već zapažnom akademskom i autorskom karijerom. Oni su sinovi, to je bitno reći, vrsnog intelektualca rahmetli Fikreta Karčića, uglednog profesora Sarajevskog i više stranih univerziteta. Skup, prva sarajevska sigurnosna konferencija. Impresivnu listu učesnika od 40 učesnika iz 15 zemalja predvodili su čak dvoje američkih senatora, senatorka Jane Shaheen i senator Peter Welch. Za razgovor za CD, Senat Pećanin je odabrao najzanimljivijeg učesnika konferencije. Dakle, radi se o pomenutom Charlesu Kupchanu, jednom od najuticajnijih teoretičara i analitičara globalne politike i geostrategije. Jednom od uskog kruga akademskih kreatora javnog mnjenja, čije stavove ne propuštaju ni u Bijeloj kući, ni dan danas, niti u Američkom kongresu. Profesor Kupchan drži katedru međunarodnih odnosa na velikom uglednom Vašingtonskom univerzitetu Georgetown, a član je i konsila za međunarodne odnose. Od 2014. do 2017. bio je specijalni, direktni face-to-face savjetnik predsjednika Amerika i stariji direktor za evropske poslove u Vijeću za nacionalnu sigurnost Obama-Biden. Sve njegove knjige su nezaobilazna lektira u svim akademskim istraživanjima, ali doslovce, moram tako da vam kažem, i priručnik, uputstvo svim predsjednicima kako što da rade.
Professor Kupchan, welcome to Sarajevo and thank you very much for this interview. I'm really happy to have opportunity to speak with you because I would have hundreds, if not thousands, questions for you, but we are speaking for the most popular, most watched TV program in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the region, and I would like to ask you just few questions about the most interesting, the acute topic of the global affairs as well as the situation in the region. Let me start with first question, not directly about the current crisis, but about the feelings that is, I'm now referring to the current terrible, bloody happenings in the Israel, Gaza. How do you personally fight with the burden that if you say something about if someone expresses fears about the destiny of the Gaza civilians in Gaza, that they would be immediately practically accused as anti-Jewish or anti-Israelis, or vice versa. Do you feel that a huge division which the tragic situation now in Israel and Gaza brought to the world scene?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we now live in a polarized global community where just about every issue ends up being us against them. And in this conflict, we should all be concerned about supporting Israel and about protecting civilian life in Gaza. It seems to me that that Israel has a right to defend itself. On the other hand, there is international humanitarian law, and Israel historically does a pretty good job of minimizing civilian casualties. This conflict, it's going to be hard to do that because Gaza is very densely populated, and because Hamas deliberately co-locates in places where they think they will be shielded by civilians, in mosques, in homes, in hospitals, in schools. So that this is going to be a bloody conflict. But I share your concern that it's hard to have a civil conversation about this issue or about any issue, in part because we do live in a very polarized age. And I do think that we are right now at a delicate moment in this conflict in which we just don't know how it will unfold in two different respects. One, what will the war aims of Israel be? Will they be more contained, which is to remove Hamas's leadership and to destroy its weapons depots? Or will it be broader, to try to uproot Hamas, not just as a military organization, but as a political movement and a social movement? That's much more ambitious and may not work. And so we have to see where Israel goes. And the other thing to watch is, does this conflict escalate? And I think you can imagine three different pathways to escalation. One is from the north, from Lebanon and Syria, Hezbollah. One is in the West Bank, where tensions are already running high. And the third is inside Israel itself, where a few years ago we saw Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews turn against each other. Mixed towns like Lod, Haifa, communities that had lived together for decades, they started fighting and burning each other's homes. That would be another setback, an awful setback. I do think that one of the reasons that the United States has put aircraft carriers in the Eastern Mediterranean is to send a message to Hezbollah and to Iran,
yeah.
Don't think about it. Don't think about it, because if you do start launching attacks against Israel, we will come after you.
If you were in position to advise Israeli government, let's say, what would be your stance? How deep, which scope of level the Israelis replay or the action would be appropriate in this time?
Well, I think that one of the reasons that Israel failed to see this coming, failed to have forces in place to prevent it, was a fundamental miscalculation about Hamas. I think this was a strategic intelligence failure, not a tactical intelligence. Actually, it was both. But at the strategic level, I think Israel, the Israeli government, had come to believe that they had reached some kind of stable equilibrium with Hamas. Hamas would lob some missiles in, they would be picked off by Iron Dome, or they would fall into an empty field, and there was a kind of, they learned to live with each other. And I think Israel has said, we can't live with Hamas. They just committed atrocities. They killed women and children and people partying in an all-night field. And so they're not going to go after and try to dismantle Hamas, and I'm sympathetic with that goal, but I do think it needs to be contained on focusing on the military, the leadership, the military infrastructure, the fighters. And Israel does have to keep in mind that if it broadens out and if it turns into a massive humanitarian nightmare, they will see that they're on the losing side of global public opinion. They will see rising anti-Israel sentiment because we will all be watching on our television screens buildings coming down, children being buried. And so there is, I think, a fine line that Israel has to walk between going after the perpetrators of this violence and going so far as to inflame global public opinion. We'll wait and see how Israel carries out this balancing act.
How do you consider, is Israeli acting according to their announcement of the scope of the military operation which is going to be undertaken? Is Israel acting within the laws of war? And how is in current global order, does the international law norms is still valid, and could it be any kind of the arms of limit of the possible military engagement of Israel?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that Israel, in general, when it goes to war, does so in a careful way. And in previous operations in Gaza, for example, they launch initial knocks on the ceilings of buildings to tell people to get out before they destroy the building. Israel is generally careful about civilian casualties. I think this is a conflict that will test restraint and will test Israel's ability to comply with international law, simply because of the density of the population and the co-location of Hamas fighters with innocent civilians. So yes, we will see tensions here, and already, for example, in preventing the flow of water, of electricity, of food, of medicine, effectively the siege of Gaza. This is already actions that are in tension with international law. But let's compare what Israel does with what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, the massacres in Bucha. Israel generally tries to exercise restraint when it carries out military operations.
Yeah. How much is Iran actually involved in the current terrible bloody attacks by Hamas in Israel? Do you believe that it could be connected with the strategically, I would say, important negotiations about the establishing new relations between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the U.S.?
From what we've seen in the public record, Hamas was not told to do this by Iran. Iran seems to have been surprised about this attack. So at least for now, we cannot draw a direct line from Tehran to Gaza City and to Hamas. Clearly, however, Hamas gets weapons from Iran, it gets money from Iran, it gets advice, everything. And we know that in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, Iran stirs up trouble. Iran attempts to undermine the status quo. And I think that Hamas, as well as Iran, were indeed very concerned about what looked like advancing normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And in general, I think if you're a Hamas leader and you're sitting in Gaza City and you're watching what's been unfolding, you're saying, what about us? Where's the Palestinian question? Because the Abraham Accords are in some ways leaving the Palestinian question behind. It's falling off the radar screen. Now Hamas has put it back on the radar screen, not in a very constructive way. In many ways, it makes some kind of settlement more elusive, because now more Israelis are going to say, wait a minute, you want us to give back more territory to the Palestinians so they can launch more missiles against us? So in the short term, it makes any kind of peace settlement more unlikely. But I do think that Iran, Hamas, others in the region were watching normalization with the Saudis, and they were worried about it. and as a consequence, they attempted to blow it up. And I think they have blown it up for now, but not permanently.
Professor Kupchan, how do you see which kind of impact, which kind of consequences the terrorist attacks, bloody terrorist attacks by Hamas in Israel could have for the war in Ukraine? What would be consequences for Ukrainians, for the Russian side?
You know, I don't think that there are clear links between the two conflicts. One hears what I would call conspiracy theories, that Russia was behind this, that Russia gets weapons from Iran, and so Iran and Russia work together to...
Excuse me, I was thinking more on the kind of the level of support for Ukrainians by the West.
Yes, but the direct linkage I don't subscribe to. The potential effects of the war in Israel with Hamas on Ukraine, I do think that needs to be watched, in the sense that clearly the conflict between Hamas and Israel is distracting attention, and it may well distract resources from the war in Ukraine, and it could make it more difficult to provide the weapons that Ukraine is looking for. But that is a question mark that was there before the war broke out in Israel. And that's because of the funding fight in the United States, with Republicans blocking more aid to Ukraine, because of a recent election in Slovakia, because of debates in Poland about whether to continue supporting Ukraine. The domestic politics of aid to Ukraine in the West, they're already becoming more complicated. I think what's about to happen in the United States is that Biden will put forward to Congress a bill for aid to Israel that also includes aid to Ukraine, as a way of convincing Congress to provide both. My guess is that he will be successful.
Professor Kupchan, you were, as far as I was following, you were one of the first kind of dissonant voices in U.S. after the Russian aggression in Ukraine started. You warned from the beginning that the end of the war in Ukraine could not be on the front line. And you today repeat, practically on the Sarajevo Security Conference, you repeated your views from the very beginning of the Russian aggression. Do you have? Are you today in better position to convince everyone that you were right than on the beginning of the war?
Well, I mean, I'm someone who supports Ukraine's fight, who believes that Ukraine is morally, ethically, legally justified in fighting to take back every inch of Ukrainian territory, restoring the borders of 1991. I've just never been very confident that they can do it on the battlefield. And over the course of 2023, we have seen the Ukrainians launch a major offensive with arms, ammunition, advice, planning provided by NATO. And that offensive hasn't gone particularly far. It has succeeded in taking back some territory in the south, but it hasn't succeeded in breaking through the Russian lines. And Russia has built several layers of defense, minefields, trenches, tank traps, earthen berms, very difficult to break through. And that's one of the reasons that the offensive hasn't gone as far as it has. We then have to ask, well, what now? If the Ukrainians weren't able to do this after we gave them all these many weapons, are they going to be able to do it next year? And I think because we just don't know that a military victory is possible or even likely, we must have a conversation about Plan B. And in my mind, Plan B most likely means a new frozen conflict where at least some part of Ukraine's territory remains occupied by Russia, but we do our best to rebuild Ukraine, to give Ukraine what it needs to defend itself over the long run, and then work at the diplomatic table to restore Ukrainian sovereignty. And I'm not naive. I don't think Putin is about to wake up in the morning and say, here, have Crimea. But you never know. Maybe in a post-Putin era, Ukraine can get it back.
Let me finish this talks with a few questions about the Western Balkans, about Bosnia and all neighbors countries. How I could say, I'm afraid that we are witnessing a changing of the American approach toward Western Balkans. For years it was policy which was kind of giving guarantees that all countries of the Western Balkans have rights for aspiration to member the EU, or for Bosnia and Kosovo even to join the NATO. But it seems in the last few years that the Biden administration changed that, if I can say in that way, kind of softer toward the West Balkans, in which they put, that they find as the key partners in the region just autocrat president of Republic of Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić. And it seems simple not to understand and to explain why that happened, why even there are a lot of proofs and sources which confirm that the just aspiration of President Vučić in Kosovo, in Montenegro, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, even in North Macedonia, made all parts of this region very unstable, even with real threat for the preserving the peace. How it could happen, and how do you see approach of the current administration led by U.S. Ambassador in Belgrade, Ambassador Hill, and Special Envoy Mr. Escobar? I don't know, are you aware of the fact that the most of people in Kosovo, in Montenegro, in Bosnia are very disappointed, particularly in comparison with the level of expectation after President Biden won the election, and we are witnessing the changing of the American policy and the and promotion policy of appeasement towards President Vučić, and who is together with leader of Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina, entity Republika Srpska, Milorad Dodik, the main actors and source of instability and insecurity in the region?
Well, I think that the Biden administration has re-engaged in the Balkans in a welcome way, and that's because really, beginning with 9/11, the U.S. focus on the Balkans that had been characteristic of Republicans and Democrats alike, that came to an end. And I now think that, especially since Trump left office and EU-U.S. relations are better, that Washington and Brussels, Washington and EU member states have been working closely together in the Balkans in a positive way. They've re-engaged. It's back on the radar screen, if you will. And I would take issue with your characterization of the U.S. betting on Vučić. I don't really think that that's what's happened, at least not from my observation point. I think what's happened is the following, that Mr. Kurti has taken steps that are seen from Washington and Brussels as needlessly provocative. The license plate issue, the identity card issue, seating mayors in the north, even though they were elected by a tiny percentage of the electorate. And as a consequence, we have gone from a situation in which the vast majority of observers saw Serbia is the problem. Serbia is dragging its feet. Serbia is stirring up trouble. And I think Kurti has in some ways damaged Kosovo's brand in the West by being seen as someone who is also now stirring up trouble. And that, I think, is somehow the best explanation, at least from my mind, of why there appears to be this tilt to Vučić. I'm not sure I would call it a tilt to Vučić. I think people still understand that Vučić is a bit of a chameleon, and he tells different parties what they want to hear, but he is also a troublemaker. He caters to the Russians. He caters to the Serb nationalists. But I would say that what we need now is all hands on deck push here in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in the relationship between Kosovo and Serbia, to get over the hump. That the big picture in this region remains positive, right? We now have a resolution of the name issue, North Macedonia. We have a number of countries in the region that are now in the EU and or NATO. We have some tough nuts to crack here and in Kosovo and Serbia, but the big picture is that this is a neighborhood that, because of proximity, because of history, will end up integrated into Euro-Atlantic institutions. I'm confident we'll get there. It's just a question of when.
And finally, probably a question that you wouldn't like, because I would ask you to predict something. Actually, how do you see change for the President Trump to be re-elected? And my question, follow-up question is the current world order that we know, as much as it's still preserved, could survive the possible another term of President Trump?
You know, former President Trump is a very talented politician, and we too easily underestimate him. Before he became president, everyone said he could never be president. And the next thing you know, you wake up in the morning and he's president. And now everyone says, well, he's never going to be reelected. It's not out of the question, but I don't think it's likely. And I don't think it's likely in part because he's going to have trouble getting beyond his base. Now, his base is big. 42% of the American electorate is still whites without a college education. They're his main base of support. But he can't win with 42%. He needs to get higher than that. And that means he needs to win centrist, moderate voters in swing states. And he's going to have trouble doing that because he is seen as a bit crazy. He's now confronting 4 major legal cases, both about his business behavior and also about his effort to overturn the election and the January 6th siege of the Capitol. So he's got a cloud over him. And as a consequence, if I were a betting man, I would bet my money on Biden. But it's open. To your second question, I would say that the current world order, you were saying, could it survive a second Trump presidency? I'm not sure it could survive a second Biden presidency. And that's because the world is changing, right? We are moving from the long run of Western hegemony, which I think goes back really to roughly the beginning of the 1800s, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, to today, to a world in which power will be much more decentered, in which China within 10 years will probably have the world's largest economy, in which major emerging powers, India, Brazil, Indonesia, they're not going to choose sides. They're not going to be with us. They're not going to be with them. they're going to pursue what the Indians call a multi-alignment world. And so I do think that we need to figure out how we are going to provide the necessary collective goods, how we're going to deliver global governance in this more decentered world. Right now, it's a pretty bleak picture because the world is getting more divided. And I think one of the key challenges that we're going to face moving forward is how do we manage these new geopolitical rivalries in a way that still allows us to work together, to focus on climate change, on nuclear proliferation, on development, on fighting pandemics. Because we are in this globalized, interdependent world that will only be in good shape if we come together to manage it. That, to me, is one of the big challenges moving forward.
Excuse me for just one last additional question. I simply cannot miss the opportunity to ask, even I don't feel so good asking you about my next question, because it's I think, a legitimate question, but it's not so nice, so feel good to ask, and you will, I'm sure, understand why. I'm asking about your consideration about the ability of President Biden to serve the next term, having in mind his age, his mental and physical abilities. How do you see that challenge?
As far as I know, he's in good shape. Having worked very closely with him during the Obama presidency, I have great confidence in him. I think he's a very decent human being. And one of his real political strengths is that he's just a normal guy who's from a working class family, who can go out into the American street and relate to people. You can feel that in him. I'll tell you a quick story from early on in my time in the White House that made me realize what kind of guy Biden is. We were coming back from a trip. I don't remember where we were. We're on Air Force Two. Biden says, I want to go home to my bed in Wilmington, Delaware, where he likes to sleep. So we land in Wilmington before the rest of us go home to Washington. And as soon as we land, I pull out my phone and I FaceTime my daughter, who's 3. And Biden comes over to say goodnight to us. He sees me on FaceTime with my 3-year-old daughter. He grabs my phone and he spends the next 20 minutes FaceTiming my daughter before the Secret Service sort of grabs the phone and says, Mr. Vice President, you need to go home. That's the kind of guy he is. Like, he's a real deal, he's a family. So I'm confident that he has what it takes to do a second term. I worry about the broader political health of the nation. I worry about division and polarization on both sides of the Atlantic. And in some ways, this worries me much more than Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping, because I think we are still living through a moment in which illiberal populism is alive and well. In Germany, right, the country where the political center is in some ways the healthiest in Europe, it's shrinking. Alternatives for Germany is getting stronger. In France, polling shows that the person who would win an election today is Marine Le Pen, right? And so our own Western liberal democracies are continuing to face threats from within. And for me, the big challenge in my own country is addressing that problem, getting Americans, working Americans back up on their feet, rebuilding the political center. Because our societies have long thrived on ideological centrism, on moderation, on good, reasonable governance. And that requires countries that work together, requires countries in which left and right share common ends and a common narrative. There's no common narrative now in the United States. You watch Fox News, you watch MSNBC, you get two very different stories about what's going on in the world. So this I think, is in some ways the greatest challenge that we face.
Professor Kupchan, thank you very much for
My
this
pleasure.
talks. Thank you.